Seoul, 1988. The starting blocks were set. The crowd was silent in the way only 80,000 people can be silent when they understand that something historic is about to happen. 8 men crouched into position, and among them stood a sprinter from Canada who had spent 4 years building toward this single moment. Not just training, obsessing, refining every angle of his start, every degree of his drive phase, every fraction of a second that separated good from legendary. The gun fired. What happened next lasted 9.79 seconds, and it changed everything. Ben Johnson did not just win the 100 meters final at the Seoul Olympic Games. He separated himself from the field in a way that made the result feel less like a race and more like a demonstration. He crossed the line with his finger raised, already celebrating before the tape broke, already knowing what the world was only beginning to process. A world record, an Olympic gold medal, a performance that felt, in that moment, like the purest expression of human speed ever witnessed. 48 hours later, it was gone. The test came back positive. The medal was stripped. The record was erased. And Ben Johnson was sent home from Seoul in a silence that carried more weight than any crowd noise ever could. But the story that followed was never simply about what Johnson had done. It was about what was done to him, about the man standing beside him on that track who walked away with the gold medal, the clean reputation, and the protection of a system that had already decided whose story it wanted to tell. Ben Johnson spent decades knowing exactly who that man was, and the hatred never left. Ben Johnson was born in Falmouth, Jamaica in 1961, the 5th of 6 children in a family that understood hard work before it ever understood opportunity. He was not identified as a sprinting prodigy in the way the sport sometimes discovers its next generation. He was quiet, slightly built, and carried a stutter that made the public world uncomfortable long before the cameras ever found him. When his family emigrated to Canada in 1976, he was 15 years old, an unknown in every sense of the word. What changed everything was a coach named Charlie Francis. Francis saw something in Johnson that the raw times alone could not fully explain. Not just speed, but a quality of acceleration that was almost mechanical in its precision. The way Johnson came out of the blocks was unlike anything Francis had coached before. Low, explosive, and controlled in a way that suggested the finish line was never really the target. The target was always the first 30 meters. Everything after that was consequence. Under Francis, Johnson developed into one of the most technically refined sprinters the sport had ever produced. By the early 1980s, he was running times that placed him among the global elite. By the mid-80s, he was something more than elite. He was a threat, a genuine, documented, undeniable threat to the man who had spent years positioning himself as the face of American sprinting, and by extension, the face of the sport itself. That man was Carl Lewis. Carl Lewis was everything the sport wanted its champion to be. Tall, articulate, marketable, and fast enough to back up every claim made on his behalf. So he had won 4 gold medals at the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984 and had spent the years that followed building a reputation that went beyond athletics. He was a brand, a symbol, the kind of athlete whose name carried weight in rooms that had nothing to do with track and field. Ben Johnson was none of those things. He was not comfortable in front of cameras. He did not move through the commercial world with the same ease. He was a sprinter in the most complete sense of the word, defined entirely by what he could do between the starting blocks and the finish line. And what he could do there was increasingly, undeniably better than what Lewis could do. Between 1985 and 1988, Johnson beat Lewis in direct competition multiple times, not narrowly, convincingly. The gap between them was growing in a direction that no amount of marketing or narrative management could reverse. Johnson was faster. The times said so. The races said so. And Lewis, for all his composure in public, understood exactly what that meant. The tension between them was never loud in the way some rivalries announced themselves. There were no dramatic confrontations, no press conference moments that defined the conflict in a single image. It lived instead in the space between them on the track, in the way Johnson's acceleration made Lewis look, for the first time in years, like he was running a different race entirely. In the way Lewis responded to Johnson's rise, not with acknowledgement, but with something closer to dismissal. Johnson noticed. He always noticed. By the time the 1988 Seoul Olympics arrived, the rivalry had reached a point where the result felt inevitable to everyone except the people who needed it to go a specific way. Johnson had been running the fastest times in the world. His preparation had been total. His focus was complete in a way that left no space for anything outside the race itself. What happened in that final is still, by any honest measure, one of the greatest individual performances in Olympic history. The reaction time, the acceleration through the first half, the controlled power of the second 50 meters, the margin of victory. Johnson won that race in every sense that matters on a track. The time he ran that day, even stripped of its official status, has only been beaten a handful of times in the decades since. And then the test. The positive result for stanozolol ended everything in the space of a press release. Johnson was stripped, sent home, and handed to a global media that had already written the story before the facts were fully understood. He became the symbol of everything wrong with the sport, the cautionary tale, the name that would be attached to doping in athletics for the next generation. Carl Lewis received the gold medal. What emerged in the years that followed was the part of the story that Johnson could never fully escape and never fully let go. The Dubin Inquiry, a Canadian government investigation into doping in sport, revealed details that went far beyond Johnson's individual case. It revealed a sport that was significantly, systematically compromised across multiple nations and multiple programs. And within those revelations, Carl Lewis's name appeared in connection with positive tests from the 1988 U.S. Olympic trials. Tests for stimulants that had been explained away, accepted by the relevant authorities, and quietly set aside. Lewis was never stripped of anything. The explanations were accepted. The matter was closed. Johnson watched all of it from the outside. The hatred that Ben Johnson carried toward Carl Lewis was never the simple emotion the word suggests. It was not the hot anger of a single moment, or the bitterness of a man who could not accept defeat. It was something colder and more precise. The hatred of a man who believed, with evidence to support the belief, that the rules had been applied to him in a way they had never been applied to the person holding his medal. Johnson spoke about it across the years in interviews that most people never fully heard because the narrative had already been decided. He pointed to the Dubin findings. He pointed to the positive tests that Lewis's team had explained as inadvertent contamination from supplements, the exact category of explanation that had been rejected in his own case. He pointed to the structure of a system that had chosen its symbol of clean greatness and arranged the available facts accordingly. What made it impossible to set aside was not the outcome itself. Athletes lose, medals get stripped, careers end in ways that feel unjust. That is part of the landscape. What made it impossible was the performance that followed. Lewis did not just receive Johnson's medal. He spent years positioning himself as the moral voice of the sport, calling out others, when he's speaking about integrity, constructing a public identity built on exactly the foundation that Johnson believed had been built on something hollow. Every time Lewis spoke about clean sport, Johnson heard it. Every time Lewis was celebrated as the standard the sport should aspire to, Johnson sat with what he knew and what the Dubin Inquiry had placed into the public record. The contrast between how their situations had been handled was not subtle, it was structural, and it had never been resolved, acknowledged, or explained in any way that Johnson found satisfactory. That was the hatred, not for losing, for watching someone else win with the same hands while being told the game had been played fairly. Ben Johnson never fully recovered the career that Seoul destroyed. He returned to competition, ran again, tested positive again in 1993, and was banned for life. The second violation removed whatever space remained for complexity in how his story was told. He became, in the public record, simply the man who cheated, the before and after of what doping could do to a career and a reputation. But the story was never that simple. It was never just about Johnson. The Seoul 100 meters final has been examined more thoroughly than almost any race in athletics history. Of the 8 men who ran that day, 6 have at various points been connected to doping violations or investigations. The race that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of human speed was, by most honest assessments, a representation of something far more complicated about the sport and the era it belonged to. Carl Lewis went on to win 4 more Olympic gold medals and retire as one of the most decorated athletes in the history of the Games. His legacy was never seriously disrupted by what the Dubin Inquiry revealed. The explanation was accepted. The story moved forward. Johnson's story did not move forward. It stopped in Seoul and has remained there in the public imagination ever since. The finger raised at the finish line, the positive test, the stripped medal, that is the version that survived. What also survived, quieter and less celebrated, was the question Johnson never stopped asking. Not whether he had done what he was accused of doing, but whether the standard applied to him had ever genuinely applied to everyone else. Whether the man who walked away with his gold medal had truly earned the moral ground he spent decades standing on. Ben Johnson grew older with that question. He carried it through every interview, every documentary, every moment when someone asked him to reflect on Seoul, and he had to decide again how much of what he actually believed he was willing to say out loud. The hatred toward Carl Lewis was never about the race. It was about everything that came after it. The silence where accountability should have been. The celebration where examination should have been. The legacy built on a foundation that Johnson believed had never been honestly inspected. He ran 9.79 seconds in Seoul. For 48 hours, it was the greatest performance in the history of the sport. Then someone else picked up the medal and kept it.